The substitute. It was during my second to last year of high school that something happened, something that still sends shivers down my spine. Our math teacher, Mrs. Thompson, was the most beloved teacher in school. She was always patient, knew each of her students well, encouraged us to give our best, and had a unique way of making everyone feel at ease. But at the beginning of September, she fell ill and had to take a leave. The school quickly hired a substitute teacher, and that's how Mrs. Parker came into our lives. Mrs. Parker had a peculiar appearance, thin, with incredibly pale skin and deep, dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. Her short, messy brown hair accentuated her pale appearance, and there was something about her expression that felt off, as if she was there but also somehow far away. On her first day, the room fell silent the moment she entered. It wasn't just her rigid presence that caused discomfort, but an inexplicable sense that something was wrong. In the days that followed, strange things began happening. Mrs. Parker seemed to know everything about us, far more than a substitute should. She called us by our names without formal introductions, and she spoke of personal things, little secrets that my friends and I had shared only with each other. I asked my classmates if they'd noticed it, and they were all equally unsettled. There was something disturbing in her guessing every detail about us. That Friday, we had a test. I was focused, answering the questions, when I heard a soft whisper. It was my name. I looked up, glancing around, but everyone else seemed to be concentrating on their own exams. I went back to writing, but then the whisper came again, louder and closer this time. It was her voice. I looked toward the front of the room, and to my shock, Mrs. Parker was facing the board, writing as if nothing had happened. When class ended, I hurried out. I spent the rest of the day feeling a strange presence, as though something was watching me. When I got home, I couldn't get Mrs. Parker out of my mind. Those hollow eyes and her unnerving presence haunted me. That night, I fell asleep with a sense that something was very wrong. Then, the nightmare began. In the dream, I was back at school, but everything was dark. The hallways stretched on infinitely, dimly lit by a cold, weak light. I walked slowly until I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was Mrs. Parker. She stood still, staring at me with those empty, bottomless eyes. I tried to run, but no matter how hard I tried to get away, she seemed to be moving closer, always the same distance away, watching me. Suddenly, I was in a classroom. Mrs. Parker stood in front of the board, writing my name over and over, her handwriting distorted and frantic. When she turned, her face was deformed, as if melting, parts of her skin slipping down her face. She reached her hand toward me, and just as she was about to touch me, I woke up. My room was shrouded in darkness, but then I noticed something disturbing. My bedroom door was ajar. I was certain I had locked it. The next day, I arrived at school still in shock. During lunch, strange rumors began to spread. Mrs. Parker had died the night before in a car accident. I was paralyzed by the news. Mrs. Parker dead? But somehow, I knew what had happened that night was more than just a nightmare. To make things worse, they mentioned that a boy had been with her in the car, though no one knew who he was. When they showed a photo of him, my shock was absolute. He was a student from our school, one who had gone missing weeks before Mrs. Parker's arrival. To this day, the mystery of Mrs. Parker haunts me. Sometimes, when I pass by the school, I get chills, like a shadow moving between the windows, as though she's still there watching, eternally waiting to return, a substitute who never truly left. The shadow in the gym. The gym had always been my favorite place in school. Since my freshman year, I spent almost every afternoon there practicing basketball. I loved it when the place was empty, after everyone had already gone. The silence of an empty gym was something that relaxed me. The sound of the ball bouncing, the echo of my footsteps, the heavy breathing after a series of shots. It was just me and the gym. But, of course, that all changed one night. It was a Friday. The team practice had ended around 7 in the evening, but I decided to stay a bit longer to work on my shooting. Everyone else had already left, even the coach. The place was completely empty. The gym was huge, with bleachers stretching along the walls, and the high ceiling made every sound seem louder, more intense. I was used to that silence, but that night there was something different. I'd been there for over an hour when I started to feel a presence. It was that feeling that I wasn't alone. I lifted my head and looked around, but there was no one. Just me and the echo of my own footsteps. I shook my head, telling myself it's just fatigue. I got back to my training. But then, I heard footsteps. Soft footsteps, very light, as if someone was walking carefully. I looked around again, listening intently. The sound was coming from the bleachers. But there was no one there. Or at least, that's what I thought. I went back to playing. I threw the ball to the ground, and it bounced louder than usual. I looked toward the bleachers, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, still unmoving, in the darkest corner near the wall. It had no clear shape. It was just a blot of darkness. But it seemed to be looking right at me. I blinked, thinking it was just the light, some weird reflection. But when I looked again, the shadow was still there. My breathing grew heavier. My heart pounded. Who, or what, was there? It was late. The gym was empty. Who else would be there at that hour? I tried to keep playing, ignoring the shadow in the corner. But the discomfort was too strong. The footsteps began again, this time closer, as if the shadow was coming down the bleachers, one step at a time. I quickly looked back to where the shadow had been before. But now it wasn't there. For some reason, I stayed put, trying to stay calm, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I started walking toward the exit, slowly. Each step echoed too loudly in the empty gym. But as I moved, the sound of footsteps didn't stop. It was as if someone was following me. When I finally reached the door, I couldn't resist and glance back. The shadow was there, just a few feet away now. More defined, like a body made of darkness. It wasn't moving, but I felt that if I stayed there 1 second longer, it would do something. Without thinking twice, I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, under the parking lot lights. That night, I went home without telling anyone. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew. I knew something had been there with me in that gym. In the days that followed, I tried to forget what happened. I went back to practicing, but I never stayed late again. But the image of that shadow wouldn't leave my mind. I started asking friends, and even some teachers, if they'd ever seen anything strange in the gym. Most laughed. They said I was imagining things. It was only a few days later that I heard something that made my heart stop. A teammate mentioned that the old janitor, Mr. Daniels, had died in the gym years ago. I had never heard that story before. He died while cleaning late at night. He had a heart attack and was only found the next morning, lying near the bleachers, in the same spot where I had seen the shadow. After that, I never practiced alone at night again. Now, whenever I pass by the school at night, I see the shadow in the gym window, always in the same place, as if it's watching me, waiting. The crying locker. I was never the type of student who liked to stand out. I kept to myself, quiet, while most of my friends were louder, more outgoing. But there was one place in the school where my best friend Tyler and I could be ourselves without anyone bothering us. The old basement hallway. A corridor filled with rusty, forgotten lockers that no one ever used. It was dark, dusty, and the ceiling was covered in water stains. The constant drip of water into puddles, well, we actually found it comforting. The flickering fluorescent light made the place feel even stranger. But for us it was perfect. No one ever went there. Or, at least that's what we thought. It all started subtly. At first, it was just another regular day. We were laughing about something stupid sitting in front of one of the lockers. Suddenly, Tyler stopped laughing. I didn't get it. He just looked at me, dead serious, as if he'd heard something. I asked him what was wrong and he whispered, "Did you hear that?" At that moment, I hadn't heard anything. But Tyler looked nervous. I didn't take him seriously. I thought he was just hearing things. But before I could say anything, I heard it too. It was a soft sound like someone crying, and it was coming from the locker right in front of us. That first time, we decided to ignore it. We figured it could be a leak, the wind, maybe just some weird echo. But the sound persisted. Every time we went back to that hallway, the crying was there, a sad, lonely sound, and each day it seemed more real, more desperate. Tyler, who'd always been the skeptic, started getting uneasy. He kept saying it was just the acoustics in the hallway, but I could see in his eyes that he was just as scared as I was. One afternoon, we decided to investigate where the sound was coming from. We walked slowly over to the locker, where the crying seemed to be echoing from. The paint on it was more worn than the others, rusted and scarred. The combination lock was stuck, but, strangely, when I pulled the handle, the door opened without any trouble. The locker was empty, and the crying stopped. A chill filled the hallway. Tyler took a step back, clearly nervous, but I stayed there, staring into the emptiness of that locker, not knowing what to do. Over the next few days, things only got worse. The sound of crying started to follow us. Even outside the hallway, I'd hear it when everything was quiet at home, in the living room, even in my bedroom at night. I started dreaming about the locker, about the door opening on its own, and a dark figure stepping out from inside. I'd always wake up with the feeling that something was in my room. Tyler began changing, too. He became quieter, avoiding talking about what was happening and especially avoiding going back to that hallway. He was clearly terrified, and that only made me more worried. Desperate, we tried to figure out what was going on. Tyler had an idea. He brought his phone and tried to record the sound. We left it inside the locker, while the crying echoed around us, and left the hallway. When we came back to listen, what we heard wasn't just crying. There was something else. Whispers. Faint, but unmistakable. The words were, "Help me. I'm trapped, please." I had never felt such fear in my life. We decided to tell a teacher, but he just laughed at our story. He said every year someone spread rumors about that hallway. But he casually mentioned that the locker had once belonged to a student who went missing years ago. She was last seen crying before she disappeared. The police never found any clues, and the case was forgotten. But now, I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. The crying, the plea for help, it was her. Somehow trapped in that locker. After that, Tyler stopped coming to school. He said he could hear the crying everywhere, and he couldn't sleep anymore. And I understood what he was feeling because I could hear it too, at home, at school, even in my dreams. The last time I went back to that hallway, I was alone. I knew I needed to put an end to this somehow. I walked up to the locker, and the crying started as soon as I got close. This time, I didn't open the door. I just stood there listening. And then, for the first time, I heard it clearly. It wasn't just whispers. It was a voice asking, "Why won't you help me?" I ran out of that hallway and never went back. And even though years have passed since I graduated, sometimes, at night, I still hear that sound. A soft cry, asking for help. And I wonder if one day we'll ever be able to set her free from whatever has trapped her there. The last detention. Nobody likes detention. And that Wednesday, it felt like even the weather wanted to make everything worse. The sky was gray, a light rain was falling outside, and the wind made the windows tremble. As I stepped into the detention room, I felt the air grow heavy, almost suffocating, as if the school itself was waiting for something to happen. That day, there were only 5 of us in detention. Strange. Usually, by the end of the semester, at least a dozen students would end up there. But for some reason that afternoon it was just us. Mr. Crowley, our history teacher, was there sitting behind his desk. His face was buried in an old, yellowed newspaper. He didn't say a word as we filed in and took our seats. It was like he didn't care that we were there at all. But the way he sat so still with his eyes fixed on the paper made me uneasy. The ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual. Time dragged on. I tried to focus on my work, but the sound of the rain, mixed with the silence, created a strange feeling. I looked around and saw the other students shifting uncomfortably, exchanging quick, nervous glances. About 30 minutes in, without any warning, Mr. Crowley stood up. He didn't say a word, just walked over to the door and left. We exchanged confused looks. It wasn't like him to leave us alone, and worse, he hadn't given any explanation. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered in a low voice before disappearing into the hallway. Minutes passed, and he didn't return. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker. At first it was slow, like an electrical glitch, but then they went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. At first no one moved. It was like we were all waiting for something. I could hear my own breathing and the pounding of my heart in my chest. Then there was a sound, a heavy breathing, coming from the back of the room. "Did you hear that?" My voice came out shaky, but no one responded. Silence returned, but it didn't last long. Soon, a disturbing noise filled the air. A dragging slow coming from the back of the room, like someone was pulling something heavy across the floor. A low, drawn-out hiss. I looked around trying to see something in the darkness, but it was impossible. The dragging continued closer now. My chair felt glued to the ground, like something was holding it down. The air around me grew thick, hard to breathe, and a sense of dread washed over me. Suddenly, a girl sitting near the door started to cry softly, breaking the silence. It was enough to jolt me into action. I ran to the door and tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I started pounding on the door, trying to force it open, but nothing happened. The dragging sound grew louder, now closer to us. It was like it was moving toward each of us slowly. The lights flickered for a second, briefly illuminating the room. And in that split moment I saw it. A dark, hunched figure stood in the corner, near the chalkboard. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, fixed on us. The lights went out again, and panic seized everyone. Someone began to scream, and I kept forcing the door, but it wouldn't open. The dragging sound was right next to us now, and I could hear the heavy breathing, almost animal-like, mixed with that hissing. It was very close. I felt something cold touch my shoulder, an icy hand, as if it were trying to grab me. And then, suddenly, the lights came on, completely. The sound stopped instantly. We looked around, and the figure was gone. There was nothing there, just us and the oppressive silence. And then the door slowly opened. Mr. Crowley stepped in, holding the same old newspaper in his hands. "Are you all right?" he asked, with a confused expression. He looked at each of us, as if he had no idea what had happened. But there was something strange in his eyes, something I couldn't explain, but it was clear to me that he wasn't the same. We left the room in silence. No one said a word, but I swear every time I pass by that room now I get chills down my spine. That figure, whatever it was, is still there waiting. And Mr. Crowley? I'm not sure if he left that room that night, or if something else came back with him. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work, and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.